The topic is very complex and very multifaceted, but for many, it's equal to recycling and waste management, which is basically narrowing it down to only the end of life of a product or of a material. If you look at circularity end to end, it's much, much broader than that. It starts with how do I design products? How do I design buildings? How do I design things so that they can last longer, that they can be reused, that they can be refurbished, and that the resources are used in the most efficient way. And resources here includes material resources, but also resources like water and energy, which specifically in an urban context is very, very important.
Welcome to the Urbanista, where we discuss the water management challenges of Nordic cities. From safe drinking water distribution and stormwater collection to building sustainable urban living environments. Here is your host, Delphine Vesalo.
Hey, welcome back, Urbanistas. Thank you so much for pressing play. Circular economy has been a concept that has increased in popularity in recent years. Many people talk about it, quote it, use it, and maybe misuse it sometimes. But how exactly circular economy is defined? How it's applied in different industries? In particular, what is the progress being made in our industry, in the construction industry? Today's guest is someone who really knows about this topic. So who are you and what you do?
Thanks, Stefan. Great to be here. My name is Michael Hanf. I work as a lead sustainable business as VTT, the Technical Research Center of Finland. And my role is basically to facilitate the transfer of research findings and insights from our very diverse research teams into actionable strategies for companies and organizations. Over the past 20 plus years, I've been working in management and strategy consulting, primarily on the intersection between strategy, digital technology, and sustainability and circularity. So really looking forward to talk with you today about the topic.
And something that you should know for our listeners, something that you should know is that he's also host of the Circular Coffee Break podcast, which we also will link in the show notes. So you also can go and listen. I have been listening, of course. Michael has lots of very good and insightful guests. And we will put the link there. It's super nice, all those conversations that you have had for the last year or so, I believe. You have been doing it.
Yeah, so it has been a year with very different guests from very different industries, from construction to textile. The latest one was around beauty and cosmetics. So looking at circularity through very different lenses, as we believe there's a lot to learn across industries on how to approach the topic and how to become more circular.
All right. So having said that, so we have our coffee here. Exactly for the coffee, well, not coffee break, but yeah. So Michael, talking about, as I was saying in the introduction, circular economy is sometimes used or misused. We hear it everywhere, quoted in many different ways. It seems that it means different things for different people. So as a concept, how would you define it? How you see this from where it came, and what would be a good definition of circular economy?
Very, very good question, Devin. Thanks. So circularity has indeed been a topic that has become very popular in, I would say, the last 1 to 2 years. And it has been used very liberally, I would say, by different people. I would argue it's not part of the mainstream yet, but it's getting there. So in its core, circular economy is all about resource efficiency. So how can we use the resources that we use in the most efficient and effective way and provide these resources a very long lifetime? As you said, the topic is very complex and very multifaceted, but for many, it's equal to recycling and waste management, which is basically narrowing it down to only the end of life of a product or of a material. If you look at circularity end to end, it's much, much broader than that. It starts with how do I design products? How do I design buildings? How do I design things so that they can last longer, that they can be reused, that they can be refurbished, and that the resources are used in the most efficient way. And resources here includes material resources, but also resources like water and energy, which specifically in an urban context is very, very important.
That's exactly what we have been hearing or reading, that many times circular economy is used interchangeably with recycling. And as you pointed out, okay, that is just one aspect of it, or let's say the final aspect. But would you say then circularity starts from the planning or from the ideation of the product, service, or building, or whatever you are going to produce? So it's starting from the idea in the planning when we are creating whatever we are going to produce.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, to stay in the urban context, I mean, if you think about a building, you basically start with planning the building, with understanding what are the resources I will be using. Will I be using recycled material? Will I be using bio-based material? Will I be using virgin materials? Then I need to make a decision. How do I minimize the usage of those resources? So how can I, in the best way possible, use the resources in the building? Then the next step is I don't want to build for a very short time period. So I don't want the building to last for a year, and then after a year I have to tear the building down. I need to think long term. How can I make the building modular? How can I make it repairable? How can I ensure that the usage of the building can be adjusted over its lifetime so that the building can be used for 50, 100 years down the road? And then at the end of the lifetime of the building, I need to think about how can I make the materials that have been used to be reused, refurbished, or recycled in that context? So can I use window frames again? Can I use specific elements in the building again? And naturally, as you said, all of this starts with the design phase. So in the design phase, I already set the path for a lot of these later steps that I've just been outlining. But at the same time, circularity actually goes across the life cycle of a product, from the initial planning to the production to the use phase, and then beyond, basically back into the circle in how the materials are used.
So if we start to break down all the things that you have just said, first, the lifetime of the final product. If there's one individual product, I have a pen here, okay, this will have 1 year, 2 years, etc. We can pretty well foresee, and we will see in the end, after 2 or 3 years, what is the result of what we plan. But the situation that we have in general in the construction industry, whether it's public infrastructure or it's a private, commercial, whatever type of building, is that we plan it, we build it, and as you said, well, the intention is that we last 20, 50, 100 years. I mean, neither you and me will be here in 100 years, for sure. So how do we ensure that whatever we put inside of this project, bridge, park, building, whatever, will be indeed, that the circularity will be leveraged within 100 years? So we can plan it as best as we can, but if within 100 years, what will be needed within 100 years to really make that final project circular?
That's an excellent question, and I think we don't have an answer to at this point in time. So I recently had a discussion with a company that works in the construction space. And what they've been saying is that there's a lot of demand for recycled material in the products that they're doing. At the same time, they cannot use the material that they've been building into their products 50 years ago, because the requirements when it comes to chemicals, when it comes to the usage of material, was very different, and it's not complying with today's regulation. in that context. So what we will be facing is that we will always plan from our perspective today. That's why it's important to keep the long term in perspective, in focus here. But that will definitely not save us from still making mistakes or making decisions that basically 50 years down the road we would have made differently than what we have today. At the same time, I think we've come a long way in actually defining the principles of circular economy, of circularity. I think there's a lot happening also in the regulatory space at the moment. A lot is happening on the city and municipality space around the topic in order to make sure that we create a framework that will be able to support also these long-term developments around usage of resources going forward.
Yeah, as you rightly point out, the buildings or the buildings that were built 50 years ago on their standards of 50 years ago, or maybe without no standard whatsoever, because we don't know how the legislation was. So we have them there. The materials cannot be reused, let alone recycled. So is the starting point really putting a solid legal framework that will last for years?
I think it's a combination of many things, as so often. I think the regulatory frame is an important one because it creates a level playing field, so that everyone understands what are the rules that we're playing by. At the same time, I think we're all needed in this. So the regulator is needed, but also we as consumers are needed. So if I'm building a house, if I'm planning a house for myself, I need to take these things in mind. If I'm a company that is basically contributing in the built environment, in the urban landscape, then I need to take these things into consideration. And regulation is always doomed to basically follow in many cases and not set the pace, even though that's changing a little bit when it comes to environmental legislation and circularity topics at the moment. So it's up to all of us to basically follow that. If I'm an architect, I need to take these things into consideration. If I'm an urban planner, I need to take these things into consideration, not because of the regulation, but just because it makes sense from a societal, from an environmental point of view in that context. So regulation is one ingredient, but there's many others there that will play and will need to play a role.
Starting from that societal or social impact, which is actually something that we have been discussing previously with a couple of people from the Green Building Council, Finland, and so start from the people. What is the impact that they may have, and starting from there. So now you said like plural. We need to create. We need to do. Who are these we? Because that's what we have been realizing. On one hand, I mean, from our side, we are the manufacturers of the building materials. There should be the construction companies, of course, the people who is planning, the actual urban designer, planner who works for another one, the municipality or whoever is the investor, even the private investor. But do you see that? Is there that sense of we? Are we working together? Are we communicating really?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think it's happening as we speak. And there's a lot of talk around ecosystems and how to build ecosystems around specific topics. And I think circularity is one of the core examples where ecosystems, cooperations, and partnerships are required. I think it's very difficult, I would argue almost impossible, for a single company to be circular all by itself. So you need to work with all the different parties. So if you are a company that produces construction material, you will need to work with the construction companies. You will need to work with the architects. You will need to work with the cities in order to make sure that you actually create a smart urban environment that basically supports sustainability goals, and that's the societal, the environmental, and the economic goals, and also complies with circular economy principles in that context. What we're seeing at the moment very often is that that chain is broken. So an architect plans a house, hands something over to the building party builds the house and then hands it over to a real estate company. But there's no continuity across that and consistency across the life cycle of a building from the starting point to the end point. And that's, I think, where topics like the digital passport, material passport or building passports comes into play, where you start basically to look at how is the building built, what are the materials being used, how can we make sure the building is maintainable. We can basically bring in materials, we can upgrade the house, we can rebuild the house, we can build a modular house so that you can actually live with the house over a longer time period. I think we're seeing that a lot in the built environment. But in other areas of our society, we don't see that necessarily. So if you buy a house, you're already thinking about how can I sell the house? The house is something long term. If I refer back to the pen you mentioned earlier, if you buy a pen, you're not necessarily thinking about, can it be repaired? Can I resell the pen? What happens at the end of the life cycle? So from that point of view, we need to make sure that this mindset of how can we utilize our resources more long term is basically utilized and embedded into all different aspects of our doing and living in that context.
So would you say that one of the main challenge is this communication, is this continuity from the material manufacturer to the constructor to the real estate developer so that we all are in the same channel, in the same page?
It adds a level of complexity to the whole topic. And if you're a company, traditionally you had visibility, maybe one or two steps in both directions to your suppliers and to your customers, but not further than that. If we think about circularity, you actually need to start developing an end-to-end value chain perspective that basically starts from the raw material, where it's sourced, how it's basically brought to your company, but also all the way to the customer, to the use phase, to the end of life cycle, and then potentially back into circulation. And that adds a level of complexity that many companies are currently trying to understand and trying to address. But yeah, I agree. I think that is one of the key critical factors that companies, but also public organizations and individuals are struggling with.
Because that's something that we are listening more and more, and at least from if the starting point, talking about materials, if the starting point is the manufacturer or even the supplier for that matter, the supply chain from cradle to gate, meaning so from the point that we sell the material, so that is pretty straightforward so far, at least in many for many manufacturers. We have the visibility of the whole supply chain. It is certified. There's some life cycle assessment behind. There's an environment product declaration behind, certifying every step and stating third-party verified, stating the carbon footprint, etc. But once it's out, kind of we not that we lose control, but we don't know where that goes. No matter there's the APD there. Okay, there you go. Yeah. There's a product. There's APD. And what we have seen, the next step or the next, when we hand over that to the next person in the race, great, there's an EPD. How do I read this? Mm-hmm. Or maybe they are comparing things, different materials, and they have two EPDs, and different formats, different things, so which matches with which, and so at least that's the first step that we are seeing, that it needs more communication, more framework, more, I don't know. How do you see this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're making a very, very important point there. And I think that is where regulation, but also standardization comes into play, to make sure that you speak a consistent language across the value chain. Um, Also, I think what we will see develop is new business models where you're basically going away from a I sell you a product model to more a rental model or to more a collaborative model, down the chain. So where a company will actually work together with the construction companies, work together with the real estate companies, more on a long term contract or long term partnership set up, and also make sure that these long-term partnerships are actually understood across the value chain. But I fully agree with you, and that's a challenge in circularity, but also in the broader sustainability agenda. And we see the same challenge in the B2B as well as in the B2C space. In the B2B space, you still have a smaller set of customers that you're communicating with. In the B2C space, if you want to get across all the different sustainability aspects for a specific product or even the circularity aspects, you basically have a very, very long list that you need to basically add in the back of the packaging. So you will have a challenge with that. And without standardization, we've seen that with nutritions and with ingredients. Once the standardization happens, you basically start to see things becoming more comparable in that context, and people getting more used to what they're looking at and how to interpret and how to use that information.
So would you say that if we just jump a bit out of the construction industry, would you say that what you quote as B2C world are those industries more innovative, or which other best practices or good things are you seeing in across different industries?
So, circular economy actually is following what we call the R strategies. So, basically, reduce usage of resources and reduce usage of products. Then repair, make sure that products are repairable. Reuse, make sure that products can be reused or components of products can be reused. They can be refurbished, for example, and then at the end of the life cycle, recycle and recover. And we are basically seeing a lot of innovation across the board currently in all of these areas. So if you think about sharing platforms, so there's a very broad spectrum of sharing platforms, be it for household appliances, but also in the industrial context. So for heavy machinery, where companies are basically listing their heavy machinery, and they borrow it to other companies. So with that, you're basically reducing the utilization, or you're increasing the utilization, and you're reducing the use of material. We see more and more companies implement circular design principles in order to basically use either bio-based material or recycled material, or make sure that the products can be repaired and can be reused at the end of their life cycle. We see a lot of take-back models, both in the textile industry as well as in many other industries, where companies are actually offering incentives for their customers if they return products, so that they can do a one-to-one reuse of materials in their products. But there's also very many other areas where we see that solutions are currently being implemented around these R strategies that I mentioned, in order to keep products either longer in usage and with that expand the utilization of materials, or then make sure that they can be reused or recycled at the end of the life cycle.
Circular design principles. That's something that sounds, I mean, at least we have not heard of, and maybe you are a bit detached from that world. Can you elaborate a bit more? What are these principles, these circular design principles?
Yeah, happy to do that. So circular design principles are very often integrated into the R&D or product development principles that companies have, where you're basically extending existing principles with guidelines or with information or design principles around the utilization of resources, materials. So to basically give your designer a hint that in the design process, they should basically look at what are the best recyclable materials, or can virgin materials be replaced with recycled materials or bio-based materials in the design process, to basically have a step to understand, are we basically using the components in our product as efficiently as possible? So some time back, we did a circular economy project with a company. And as part of the process, we basically asked the participant in the workshop to look at one of their own products and take it apart and basically look at what are the components. How could you basically design the same product with circular design in mind? And the first thing they found out was that there were springs used in the product, and there were actually multiple springs used. And the first question was like, why are we using multiple springs? Why are we not using one? That would do the same thing, it would do the same job, and it would reduce our resource utilization in the specific product. So looking at things from that perspective and looking with circularity, longevity, reusability in mind can actually, as we established in the beginning, drive a very significant impact down the road in the use phase, or then also at the end of lifetime of products, of buildings, of very many different aspects.
Actually, coming back to the raw materials, what you mentioned. So at the start of the journey, when we are designing, we are creating whatever is the product. Talking about the raw materials, which innovations have you seen? Which are the raw materials that you think are ahead of the other ones? I mean, there could be plastic, there could be metal or steel, there could be concrete, there could be, many things that are used right now in the construction industry. But any insight? How do you see these raw materials being sustainable or not?
Or not. So there's a very broad spectrum of things that is currently happening in the construction space, but also more broadly in the urban environment when it comes to raw materials, use of raw materials, but also in the utilization. I think one trend we're seeing, and that's something that's most recent in the demolishing of buildings. Traditionally, you would have basically one big basket, and all the waste would go in there, and that would go either to the landfill or to the incineration. But there wouldn't be much done with that. What we're seeing today is basically an effort to reuse a lot of the materials. The regulation is not always supporting that today. But we see that a lot of the materials of demolished buildings are reused in different contexts or in a similar context going forward. We see in the space of concrete, you mentioned concrete is very energy intense as an industry. So we currently see a lot of efforts around electrification in that space. So how can you electrify specific steps? But also, how can we replace specific ingredients with recycled material or with side streams from other industries? That's why, back to the point earlier, why the cooperation even across industry is so important, because side streams or waste streams, if you want, from one industry could actually be a very good input for other industries in that context. What we're seeing a lot is basically harmful materials being replaced by bio-based materials. You see a lot of more wood being used in the construction nowadays than in the past. So there's very many different aspects that you can be looking at. There's a lot of effort put also into digital solutions at the moment, where I mentioned the material passport or the building passport, where startups or companies are looking to actually collect the data in a central way so that either a real estate company or private person actually has an end-to-end documentation of what was done in the house, what materials have been used, and so on and so forth. So there's a multifaceted set of activities that are currently ongoing from a material science point of view through more operational topics all the way down to the end of life, the recycling, the reuse of materials in that context. And again, very many different parties involved. So the companies that are producing the building material, the construction material, but also the companies that are building, the companies that are operating the buildings, as well as the municipalities and cities that are actually putting legislation in place, that are actually creating the platform to drive circularity in that context and resource efficiency.
Because one of the things that we have seen as well is that to be recycled material, sometimes it's, as you said, it ends up in the landfill, ends up in incineration, and for our purpose, the plastic, okay, we have certain products where the standard legislation allows to use recycled. Where is that recycled? Sometimes we are falling short of. So where's that part of plastic that should come back? Sometimes, as you say, it's part of the system that is not really coming back to the industry. Or actually, one of the first guests that we had here over a year ago was one of the pioneer companies in Denmark who started to do this 40 years ago already. Yeah. They were recycling plastic 40 years ago with the technology at the time, but still he was saying that, hey, it's still a challenge to get this used plastic. Okay, we sort it out, we divide, etc., but it's still a problem.
Yeah, and if you look at plastic specifically, plastic is not plastic. So you have very different types of plastics. So PET plastic, for example, can be easily recycled and can be reused very easily. There's other forms of plastic that is not so easy to recycle and reuse. And in specific industries, I mean, if you look at the food industry, food packaging, if you collect plastic waste from homes across the country, across the world, you basically start contaminating the plastic, and it cannot be used for the same purpose it was used for in the first place. So there's a lot of things that need to be sorted out around recycling and reuse of plastic. At the same time, what we're already seeing, and I had an interesting discussion with a company a couple of months back. They're actually looking at, in the construction industry, to use recycled aluminium. And what they're saying is our market is basically demanding very high recycled aluminium content in our products, up to 80% in many cases. At the same time, there is no market for recycled aluminium. There is no recycled aluminium available in the market because the automotive industry is basically buying up all the recycled aluminium. So if we think about recycled material usage and all of that, I think companies also need to start thinking, what is their strategy to secure recycled material streams? But also, back to your point, how do you make these materials recyclable? There's technical development. We're now talking about chemical recycling instead of other ways of recycling. That will help, but that again is then very energy intensive. So there will be trade-offs with other sustainability targets that companies have in that context. So there's various aspects you need to take into consideration, even in that recycling space, if you think about that. And it's a much broader topic than basically just saying like, oh yeah, let's use recycled plastic, because that's basically the name of the game today.
Because it's kind of a balance act because you are getting material to be recycled. Okay, I am offsetting or I am reducing carbon footprint in X amount, whatever, because I'm recycling. But in the process of recycling, I am using energy, electricity, whatever, and then we are saving in one way, in one side, and we are spending in the other side. So it's like, how do we balance this? Like, really?
Absolutely, and that's a huge question. It's a huge equation that you're trying to solve here for. And I mentioned chemical recycling and the energy consumption there, but the other component is logistics. So if you think about and I had a discussion about that some time back about the foam that's used for windows as isolation. And you think about recycling that. So you take down a building, you take all the foam, you put it on a truck, it weighs virtually nothing. So the truck is virtually empty. It drives all across Europe to a recycling plant somewhere. It's recycled there, and then it's basically carried all the way back to the next construction site. From an environmental footprint point of view, how is your outcome? Are you positive, or are you basically creating more CO2 with your logistics and all of the things around it, compared to basically creating new material that will basically be produced at the location? So I think there's a lot of topics that need to be taken into consideration. And we're talking with urbanistas here. We're talking about urban planning. And when you talk about circularity and sustainability, one aspect is naturally to think about the usage of material and resources, both in the building phase, but also in the operational phase of an urban environment. At the same time, I think what we will be more and more looking at is how will the urban environment support sustainability and circularity? How will, for example, the planning of industrial areas in cities support industrial symbiosis? How will I enable citizens living in an urban space to live in a circular way by placing repair shops very close by enabling them with services and with the logistics around circularity? So that will be an additional requirement when I think about planning cities, planning urban spaces. How do I enable a sustainable, a circular, a smart way of living going forward in that context?
Yeah, as you say, it is taking this broad, holistic view, because the urban planner can design and can put everything perfectly rounded, circular economy, environmentally friendly, whatever you want to call it, is perfectly rounded. And then it gets delivered. We start building the materials based on bio-based materials or sustainable, renewable raw materials come into place. Great. But those materials are transported by the construction company or whoever is the contractor, are transported in trucks that they still use diesel, like normal diesel. Or maybe they are electric, but from where that electricity that is feeding those trucks come is how the contamination, the third-party contamination, or contaminated somewhere else, that it is electricity, but that electricity was produced at the origin using fossil materials. It's a huge puzzle, and we may or may not have visibility of all those things. It's so complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And you combine that with our world today, where basically reading the headline and swiping left or right is very common. So you basically combine that with a world where the attention span of a lot of people is very low. And then you bring a very complex topic that's very multifaceted into the discussion. And that is a challenge today. And that's why education, taking people with you and basically making the whole topic experienceable. So basically bringing the topic from a very abstract, very complex level down to a very experienceable level where people really understand what does that mean in my context and how do I do that. We've recently been working with a construction company as they basically said, circularity, sustainability is a very important topic for us. And our leadership team understands the topic very well. But we need to find a way to actually bring the topic down to the construction site, down to the shop floor, where the people are actually really having an impact on a day-to-day basis, because they will be sorting the waste. They will be using the material. They will make sure that we use energy and water efficiently at the construction site, and so on and so forth. And I think that is something that we really need to start looking into. How do we bring these topics in an experienceable, relatable way to the place where the work is actually being done? And that includes architects, that includes construction, but that then also includes real estate companies and the people that do the maintenance of buildings or of the whole infrastructure in that context.
To create more awareness of the whole circular economy concept is education, education. Who's pushing for this? What have you seen that is, companies or sectors that are really trying hard to communicate, to educate the rest of the industry?
So, it starts with guys like us, Delfin, talking about the topic and basically making sure that people are aware of it. And I think that is one of the things. So very recently, I had a guest in my podcast. And what she said is, we very often as consumers or as users, we discuss about the fact that companies are not sustainable and how we want companies to be more sustainable and more circular. But then the minute we step our foot into the door of the office, we forget all about that and we become corporate people. And we basically do the same thing we always did.
We are sustainable from 8 to 4, and then 401, we just go out and buy whatever in the supermarket and we don't care about it.
Exactly. So I think it starts with all of us to basically educate ourselves. There's naturally a formal side of it. There's the formal education system that more and more needs to take these things into consideration from a very early age. In the educational context, but it's a responsibility of companies to be advocates and to start talking about these things. And we're seeing this actually more and more, to be fair, that companies are going out, that they're talking about the topics, that they're educating their employees, that they're educating their customers around the topic. Now, personally, is it happening on the extent it should? I'm always a big fan of we can accelerate and we can do more. In this context. But we see that these things are happening and that we're moving in the direction. And having two teenage sons, I see that the younger generation is much more aware of these topics and is already much more taking these into consideration in their everyday thinking and their everyday approach on not necessarily buying, but basically buying secondhand or renting things or reusing things, repurposing things very often.
You talk about accelerating this process, but what is preventing that we move forward and we move faster? Is it cultural? Is it there may be many things. One thing that we have seen is, it may be cultural, it may be in the DNA, it may be in what's on their water that they drink. In the Nordic countries, across the Nordic countries, they are clearly they are ahead of the rest of Europe in many aspects. But within the Nordic countries, Denmark is actually making headways. Norway, they are there, with specific legislation. Sweden, Finland, well, they are there more or less, or trying to catch up. Also in Finland. How do you see this? Who is ahead of who, but what factors are the ones that are accelerating or making it slower, this process?
It's a very good question. And we see some countries, as you said, being able to take the lead and accelerate these topics. We see some countries in the middle of the pack, and we see some countries lagging behind in this topic. I'm reminded of a picture that's very often shared in social media, where the first picture is who wants change, and everyone raises their hand, and then the second question is who wants to change, and everyone is basically looking to the floor and basically pretending they haven't heard the question. And that's exactly the thing here, that very often you hear like, yeah, we need to be more sustainable. We need to address the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss, the freshwater scarcity, and all of these things. But I cannot be expected to change. And that's the same on corporate and on individual level very often. So I think it actually needs to be a combination of many things. It needs to be a combination of regulation, of basically setting the right frame, a combination of education, as we just established, telling people how they can contribute and making sure that they understand and make it experienceable for them. And it's also about creating the urgency behind it and changing our thinking process around it in that context with the tools and the mechanisms that we have, and take responsibility as companies, as citizens, as individuals in the process going forward. Now, saying that, I think there are some really promising signals that we get, and I think we've seen specifically over the past years many companies that really take responsibility and take the topic serious, and are really working hard on these topics. We established it's complex, it's difficult, it's not an easy step, so it will take time. But we see an accelerated focus on these topics, and hopefully that will help all of us to basically drive these topics forward in combination of all of these different stakeholders. There is unfortunately no silver bullet here where we could easily copy something, because it's all very very contextual and very dependent on the country, on the society, on the development, and all of that.
Or because we have been talking about the different stakeholders and construction industry or not, but it's more like an institutions. Talking about institutions, you also mentioned like citizens, that you and me, the normal person outside there in the street, as a consumers. What could we do as a citizens, as a consumers, to more actively promote circularity? Is there something that comes to mind, or is there some ideas, some research that you have been involved in at grassroots level movement or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we can actually do. I believe. I think it starts with our everyday buying decisions. As you mentioned earlier, not go out and buy the cheapest product, but buy a product with circularity in mind. There's also other examples. I very recently spoke with the founder of Circular Berlin, which is a grassroots initiative in Berlin, basically driving circularity in the city, with a group of people really looking at how can circularity be done, looking at the material streams, how can companies and organizations be supported, how can we educate different parts of the population, be it companies, be it citizens, in that context. So there's a lot of things we can do in that context. One thing is naturally to bring the topic up also in the discussions and discourse in the political space. We're living in a world, specifically in many of the Western countries, where the election cycle is basically driving the political agenda. So if politicians, if governments start realizing how important these topics are for their success in the next election, that's an important element in that context. So there's a lot of I would say micro actions that you can take. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, we're citizens, we're individuals, but we're also basically working in the corporate context. So we have the possibility for our companies, for our organizations to raise the topic up and discuss it with our colleagues, with our bosses, with our customers, and make sure that it is on the agenda of our companies, of our governments, and our cities and municipalities.
But still, takes time. Takes time.
Absolutely.
How do you see this in perspective of 1 year, 2 years, 10 years in our generation?
It's a difficult question because time is one of the things we don't have, and we see that if you read the news, if you look at research findings across the board, we're actually starting to run out of time, and we need very urgent action. So when it comes to me, I hope we're getting our act together, so to say, within the next couple of years. Otherwise, we might actually not be able to address many of the challenges we are facing or will be facing. But I think it's about accelerating, and it's about all of us doing our part, and all of us contributing. And as in so many things, it's the power of the crowd. It's the power of society to actually drive change. And once it becomes top of the agenda of societies, and of the world as a whole, I think then we're able to really accelerate the topics. If companies see that they cannot sell their unsustainable products, they will be very fast to address the topic. But if they can still sell their products and still make good profits with their products, then there's no incentive to change and to address different requirements in that context. So I think that's
In the end, it's an economic monetary incentive.
absolutely.
At the end of the day, would you say that's the strongest incentive?
Absolutely. And I mean, we've been building our economic systems for hundreds of years. And now we're basically looking to change them within 1 or 2 years. Structured thinking processes, mindsets, approaches that have been growing over generations, that now need to be changed in a very, very rapid pace. And we see that change has always been slow and difficult, and it takes effort to put it in place. I think the incentive is undeniable. There is an incentive to do these changes, as we already see now what the alternative is. So I hope that for all of us, that's a signal to accelerate and also make changes that might not be the changes that we want to do, and that might be painful at times.
If you would be sending a message to the people planning the cities, developing the cities, what would be your key message summarizing this conversation? How would you like to say that this is the way, or this is the main thing that you have to think if we want to have circular cities within a year, a decade, or?
I think it's about making sure that you get out of your bubble, that you get out of your traditional way of thinking, and that you familiarize yourself with circularity, but also more broadly sustainability aspects of urban planning, of construction, of all of these different aspects. And in some areas, you might think like circularity is not relevant for me. If you're an energy company, yeah, what's circularity in the energy context? How can energy be circular? If you're a water company, how can water be circular? But all of the resources we're using in an urban context are scarce, are limited on our planet. So wherever you are in the urban planning process, be it you're working with concrete, you're working with aluminium in building a house, you're working with water, you're working with energy, you're working with all of these different resources. Familiarize yourself with sustainability principles, familiarize yourself with circularity principles, ingrain them into your normal process of doing things, and make sure you talk with your colleagues, with your suppliers, with your partners about the topics, so that you can jointly address the topic and see how you can build better solutions going forward. I think that would be the main thing I would be asking for, if I would be asked to put it into some sentences. Sorry, it wasn't one sentence. It was
more
of a speech.
That was a blast. So yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This has been really a really insightful conversation. And if I even could commit you, let's say within 6 months or so, can we catch up again? Let's see how are we progressing. Hopefully, yeah, progressing.
Yes.
What is the latest that you have seen? Well, look into 2024. That will be really nice to have that kind of update. How are we moving? How are we progressing?
Absolutely, more than happy. It was a pleasure. Thanks,
So
Jeff.
thank you very much, Michael. And the Urbanistas, you listen directly from the expert what you should have in your mind. So thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Urbanista podcast, a production of Uponor Infra, the leader in sustainable infrastructure solutions. If you found it interesting, why don't you share it with your colleagues? We all together can move our industry forward.